I've suffered from migraines my entire life, episodes of blinding headaches, depression, and, well, it's not a fun time. My doctor diagnosed me when I was about 7 years old. He said I was the youngest case he had ever seen, and that it was possible that I had been suffering from them since infancy. This may explain why I was something of an overtly emotional child who could go from 0 to 10 in the blink of an eye. It must have been tough for my parents, but they always looked out for me and were incredible along the way. Though my father has passed on, my mother remains as caring as she always has been. But I'm not here to give you my family history. I'm here to share some frightening stories with you. You see, I can't help but think that although these problems have significantly impacted my life, that there is an upside of sorts. You see, I think the migraines I suffer from are partly why I'm a writer. One aspect of these, sometimes almost delirious episodes, is that I have dreams that seem as real to me as waking life, and fragments of ideas boil up out of that feverish state. Faces I have never seen, places I have never visited, and events that I hope are not real. I'll make one of these videos every now and then to share some of these unusual dreams with you. Bear in mind that they will be fragmented, not entirely constructed stories, and that they may make little sense sometimes at first glance, but the most interesting of these dreams and nightmares are almost fully fledged stories, complete as if given to me by someone else. Let me begin with one quick tale tonight from these episodes to get us started. When I was a child, don't many scary stories start that way, there was a glass door in the living room of my house. The glass was decoratively warped so that when someone passed by, you could see their shape, but not exactly who was there. I remember playing on the floor of the living room many times and looking back at the glass door, entranced by how it twisted and contorted light. The door opened into the hallway, which turned at a right angle to the front door of the house out of view. And when the yellow incandescent light was turned on at night, it was as though the light struggled to hold itself together as it passed through the glass, reflecting in the bobbled surface. I used to wonder if the glass door gathered the light somehow or absorbed it. I didn't understand what light really was at that age, and to me it seemed quite natural that it should behave like anything else in the world. It was a thing that could be contained, perhaps even held and used for some unknown purpose. There was a magic to it, and it was always, without exception, associated in my mind with the banishing of evil and darkness. Staring at that glass was interesting, but, like most kids, I would quickly return to my toys on the floor, except when I dreamed. Although I was lying in my bed, sound asleep, in the dream I would be there on the floor of the living room with my toys, not knowing that I wasn't awake. It felt as real as my voice is to you right now. In the dream, my father would be, quite happily, as he often was, in his armchair, watching television or reading a book. My mother would likewise be sitting, chatting away to us, and always making sure that I was warm enough on the floor. We lived in one of the highest hills in Glasgow, and so the large window of the living room looked out across the city at night. That window loomed across the room in opposition to the warped glass door. The orange points of light outside in the black of night, each of them a street lamp, were joined occasionally by the wandering twin white lights from cars driving through the darkness to unknown locations. Phantom travellers out there, but in reality, inside my mind. I would stare down at the toys on the floor in front of me, sitting almost exactly between the window and the glass door. Cars, trucks, maybe some action toys were in my hands as I played enthusiastically, making worlds in my mind, usually involving a titanic struggle between good and evil. Good always won. But then something would happen in the dream. The room would grow darker somehow, emptier. I'd look up and see that my father's chair was now empty, and that my mother was gone as well. I was alone with my toys on the floor, bewildered as to where my parents had gone. Then outside in the night air, the world would start to fade away. The innumerable city lights would begin to vanish like an audience of candles extinguished one by one. A wave of darkness would slowly fall across the city towards my house until the outside world had evaporated completely. Nothing would remain but my home. Fear would course through my bones, not an intellectual one, not one based on questions that could figure out just what was happening. No, a primordial fear, the purest of terror, at something utterly inhuman consuming the world. The only question that would eventually form in my mind was, what is the dark made of? The floor would then grow cold around me, as though frost were buckling the wooden floorboards beneath the carpet. They creaked and groaned as the temperature plummeted. It would then be that the light from the living room lamp would not vanish immediately, but dim and buzz. It was as though the light were being drained away by some unseen vampiric force, until finally it fizzled out and I was left in the bleakest of frozen nights. Looking up, I would see the warped glass of the closed living room door in front of me. The only light then came from the yellow incandescence of the ceiling lamp in the hall, which was just out of view. The light filled up each bubble and depression of the glass in the door, as it always had, but now, in that moment, it had something much more valuable than mere illumination. It was the only comfort left in the world. There was no rationale in my mind at this point for what was happening. I only knew somehow implicitly that it was no longer a question of what was in the darkness, but rather that what was coming for me was the darkness itself. It would be then that I would hear the front door to the house out of view at the end of the hall creak with pressure, something pushing and prodding against it as though searching for a weak point. The cataclysmic noise of wood and glass being shattered and cast asunder then made me jump in shock at that moment in the dream. I knew without looking that the door to the darkness of the world outside was now gone. This would then be followed by the unmistakable sound of thudding footsteps at the end of the hall. Whatever it was that entered the house at this juncture, it was large and heavy. Along the hallway it would come, and I would stand, clutching one of my action figures out of comfort, holding on to those fictional stories I would usually act out with my toys, hoping that good would of course triumph over evil. After all, that was what I had always been told, wasn't it? That good would defeat evil. And yet, the thing in the hall would continue moving towards where I sat on the floor. I stared, shaking with fear around me, looking at the warped glass with the light pulled and collected in the dips and crevices of its surface. It would be here that the thing would finally reveal itself. A shudder would run through my body. The thing in the hall was on all fours, and even then it was as tall as a person. Despite its appearance behind the obscuring glass, it was no animal. Yes, indeed it did walk on all fours, but it was not of this world. Not the one I knew of at that age as a child. It turned its head and pushed its face up against the glowing glass at this point, and I will never forget the impression of hair and shadow against that glass. Two eyes glaring at me, as though I were the intruder in my own dream. It would then push itself up against the warped glass door, as if unable to break down that barrier momentarily. And in that moment, as the little child on that floor on my own in the encroaching darkness, I only had one thought in my mind with which to describe this thing of darkness, and it was the Fiend. I invariably cried out at this moment and quickly found myself in the warmth of my bed. My mother and father would be standing over me, comforting me as I cried. "Something is coming," I would say over and over to them. "Something is coming." Of course, they told me it was just a dream and that it was because I wasn't feeling well. It was a product of the headaches, you see, the blinding pain that would help me drift in and out of wakefulness, the agony that would push me from the conscious, wakeful world that we all know day to day into that bleak part of my dreaming mind and then back again. The dream has faded now, thankfully. I rarely have it, and if I do, it's incomplete. It never plays out to its end, and I'm glad for that. For although I know the Fiend is a product of my own dreaming mind, I wouldn't want to encounter it again, or its ability to slowly erode the world around me. And that is that, as they say. I hope your nightly excursions into your own mind do not conjure up a fiend of your own, or worse still, one that we share and stalks us all. Sweet dreams, dear listeners, and I'll see you again in the next video.